what I'd like to do then in this little bit is to go back and unpack how some of this instruction about the letting go, the letting go of thoughts, the reconfiguration of your attention is actually implicit in the Cloud of Unknowing and may serve as an interpretive key to some of its most difficult passages. So the Cloud of Unknowing, let's talk about it a little bit first. It's a 14th century English spiritual classic. And as I said a little bit before in my first talk, it was written by an anonymous spiritual teacher, clearly monastic, in the 14th century, and is roughly contemporaneous with some of the other great things that happened in the 14th century, like the Canterbury Tales and Julian of Norwich. It comes from that period when Britain, when the language all of a sudden came together and the vernacular that we nowadays know as English came into being. It may not look like English when you read it, because it looks like a real German English, but it's the start of the headwaters of our language. So the author is anonymous, and of course, as soon as somebody is anonymous, people speculate why. And there have been all sorts of speculations, including that maybe it was anonymous because he was a she. I don't think so, although I'd like to say that it certainly is conceivably possible. The reason that it would be a woman is no reason it couldn't be written. Julian of Norwich wrote by her own name. But more, when I read the language and imagery base of the thing, it just feels so overwhelmingly male, the language about riding into warfare and spears and barrels and piercing the cloud of unknowing, just unless it was written secretly by Joan of Arc. The energy seems male to me, and I'm pretty much with the usual interpretation that it was probably written by an older Carthusian monk. The Carthusian order is a rather strict, contemplative, silent, people are sort of separated and deeply silent order that really does deep exploration of the spiritual life, clearly written to a disciple who already has considerable practice under his belt and is advancing to a stage which the author calls contemplative. And in the afternoon, we're going to talk about what is meant by this phrase, so we'll just hold it. But he's trying to take this young student and bring him along to the next level in his spiritual journey. One of the reasons that it might be anonymous is that it may have happened in-house in a monastery without a lot of emphasis given to author and identity. Another reason is that clearly the times were dicey. Already in this century, you would begin to see the headwaters of the movement towards let's get the Bible into the vernacular and into the hands of the lay people. The beginning of the Lollards, the first threats to the monolith of Roman Catholic authority. And about less than 100 years later, you would find people writing in the language of the non-dual, like Meister Eckhart, running seriously afoul of the political and hierarchical structure of the church. So some of the propositions that the author is advancing here could be construed as dicey. Certainly so if you're exploring them from that level of simply conceptual thought. because like most mystics and visionaries, he's writing from a different kind of level and in a different kind of language that really kind of scrambles and defies what it seems like it says to the rational mind. And if any of you are scholars out there and want to plow into that in a book that's a classic in the field, though quite difficult, I recommend Michael Sells, S-E-L-L-S, The Mystical Language of Unsaying, as a powerful look at the language that mystics write and teach in and how it goes about scrambling dualistic propositions. That'll be a footnote for most of you, but if you want to dig into it. Mystical utterance is consistently misunderstood because it emerges from a different level of consciousness. Anyway, it's better to not put your signature to it if you prize your head and your genitals. Enough being said, when I first read The Cloud of Unknowing, it was in the late 1960s, I read it in the Middle English. There's a whole set of textbooks that are put out by a wonderful organization called the Early English Text Society. Where they just went in the early 20th century and began to collect all the manuscripts all over everywhere and get them out so people could at least read the raw language. I had to read it in Middle English, and I later discovered all of the usual suspects in the translations and discovered most of them range from bad to horrid. But more on that later. One of the things that you'll find in my new book is a raw translation of most of the original texts, which I'll be reading from here, because most of the common texts we have, particularly the William Johnston one that is everybody's most favorite popular book in contemplative outreach networks, badly distorts what's actually there in the Middle English, reads it through a heavy filter of theological assumptions that aren't there in the original, and thus actually make it difficult, if not impossible, to see what's going on in the Middle English. So some of the things that I'll say today, if you go back to the Johnston edition, you won't find it in the text. But it is there in the Middle English. Well, whatever edition you're reading it from, you don't need much more to be confused when you read the first bit of The Cloud, Chapter 3, which is where the author really gets down to business. Yeah, I remember coming into this when I was 1968. I was 21. I was reading this classic. I was also a spiritual seeker at the time, though I didn't know it. And it says, "Lift up your heart unto God with a meek stirring of love, and intend by that himself," capital H, God, "and none of his goods. And to that end, be loath to think on anything else but on himself, so that nothing works in your mind or in your will, but only himself. And to do that in yourself is to forget all the creatures that ever God made and their works, so that your thoughts and your desires are not directed or stretched to any one of them, either in general or in specific. But let them be, and take no notice of them." Well, when I first read that instruction, I thought what this author was trying to say, that what you were supposed to do is to think about God 24/7 and nothing else. It says that. And lift up your heart unto God and intend by that himself. Intend God and none of his goods, none of his other stuff. And be loath to think on anything else but himself. So I thought, okay, well, if you want to be a contemplative, you just got to think about God 24/7. So let's not think about picking up my daughter at the daycare center, and let's not think about paying the income tax. And I was feeling sort of vaguely guilty every time I thought about anything else except God. Well, later in chapter 6 in the Cloud, he's going to make it more difficult by saying specifically, but of God no man can think. So, boom, what catch-22. But anyway, the first instruction I saw here was that somehow you got to be thinking holy thoughts all day. You got to be pondering God all day, or else you're not in the contemplative game. So I gave up on that pretty fast as useless. But then there was the other thing in there that was even more kind of offensive. And it said, and to do that is to forget all the creatures that ever God made and their works, so that your thoughts and your desires are not directed to them. Well, that sounded like just that kind of, meditational navel-gazing. Are we supposed to not love the creatures of this planet? And it is the word creatures that's used there. And it sounded like what he said is to shut yourself up in some little monastic ivory tower and just try to think about God all day and not care for anything beautiful in the world. And do you agree? It sounds like that? Has that ever tripped you up? It's challenging. But I'm going to maintain, first of all, that the Cloud of Unknowing is written in a kind of code. That these terms, like cloud, like creatures, like think, like love, all have a specific meaning. And they're not quite the meaning that you think about when you just read them unaware of the context clues. And what you have to partly do is to unpack these and unravel them and find the first place where it begins to make clear sense, and then develop your own glossary of what the cloud means by these terms. And I actually give you that in my book, but we'll get there. But what I'm going to suggest is that this first piece that he can give you makes sense once you buy as a kind of hypothesis that what he's talking about here is he's trying to find metaphors to talk about the configuration of your attention. And so I'll go back and try and take you through it on that. Lift up your heart unto God with a meek stirring of love. Well, that part, sorry, I'm not going to break it open for you today, right now. I've got the rest of the book to do it about what he means by lifting up your heart with a meek stirring of love. Both of these ideas will come clear, what heart means, what meek means, and what stirring means. But today I want to stay focused on this object awarelessness bit, because it's a solid piece you can take home. And intend by that God and none of his goods. His goods and his creatures. The goods are all the objects, the virtues, the qualities of God. Let's not get thinking about the qualities. Let's just stay gathered on God. And then he goes on to say, and to that end, be loath to think on anything else but himself. So that admittedly sounds like he's saying, just think on God, make God the subject of your attention. But then he adds this interesting thing, so that nothing works in your mind or in your will, but only himself. Now that's an interesting qualifier. He's saying, first of all, think about this. Keep your mind in God so that nothing else is there. Nothing works in either your mind or your will. But then he says, but only himself. And if you follow the grammar of that sentence, what he's saying is not so much that you are thinking about God, but that God is working in you. Can you see how I get that? Listen, I'll say it one more time. Be loath to think on anything on himself, so that nothing works in your mind or in your will. In other words, you're not putting your attention on anything, you're not bothering it, but only himself. In other words, God becomes the principal subjective agent working in you. And then he does this to say, and to do that in yourself is to forget all the creatures that ever God made and their works, so that your thoughts and your desires are not directed or stretched to any of them. Now, if you stay with that, forget them so that your thoughts and your desires are not directed or stretched to any of them. Well, that sounds a little bit like the instruction in centering prayer, doesn't it? To let go of all the objects of your attention. And I believe that's in case what he's saying. When he talks about forgetting the creatures, the closest equivalent is in the centering prayer, letting go of the objects, God himself, the objects of your attention, these creatures that God made, these thoughts, these virtues, these qualities, they're all objects of your attention, right? Let them go so that your thoughts and desires are not directed, and then are very interestingly, or stretched to any of them. Now, if you think about that in terms of, what I was giving you as the subject-object connectivity, see that dimension of the attaching, stretching subject and object? It's a word that doesn't make sense unless you assume that he's got this implicit notion of your attention in a couple of different forms. And a lot of the translations just wipe that one out. They don't know what stretched means. But it's a linear image talking about let's let go of this linear configuration of our attention, running out to any of these creatures, any of these objects, any of these properties of God, anything that we can think of about God, so that our mind and our attentions and thoughts are not directed there, either in general or in specific. But let them be, and take no notice of them. Straight out of centering prayer, right? It's almost like he had been one of Thomas Keating's students. So we can begin to see, I think the closest way that you can begin to get a handle on the teaching here is if you start your glossary of the Cloud of Unknowing by saying forgetting is the equivalent of what we call in centering prayer letting go. And he uses that almost synonymously. He'll sometimes say, put a cloud of forgetting between you and them. That's a very, very common phrase in it. In other words, let them go and enter what he calls a cloud of unknowing, which I am going to suggest just very lightly in this group because we're not going to do textual and analysis of the whole thing. But the cloud of unknowing is his metaphor for the kind of diffuse awareness that happens in this state of objectless awareness. And he calls it a cloud because clouds are cloudy, right? You don't see things sharply, particularly in this part of the world. But it's his image for a different kind of awareness, a different kind of perceptivity, a different kind of meeting ground. Remember, I talked this morning about this inter-abiding ground in which your kind of awareness and the divine awareness are kind of commingled, so you're not seeing clearly. God is not the object anymore, the object of your thought. And I think the cloud of his unknowing is his code word for that. So we forget, or we put a cloud of forgetting between us and specific objects of our attention, which are consistently called in this book the creatures, the thoughts, the objects of our attention. So he's not saying here to hate and disparage the world and spend your whole time trying to think about God, because if you're thinking about God, God's self becomes an object, right? But rather, let them be. Don't let your attention be stretched to them and forget them. So, and just let them be. Don't try and cancel them out. Don't try and squash them. But enter this cloud where a different kind of perceptivity will gradually fill in. So all that's basically there. My real proof text for how this works is in Cloud 5, which is a very, very short chapter. And if you read it in the Johnston edition, you won't get any of this translation. But he introduces an image of the archer with the target as a symbol of your attention. And I think it's the most powerful single-line clue to me that he's actually talking about the configuration of your attention. And here's how the passage goes in Cloud 5. For although it may be quite profitable to think sometimes of certain conditions or deeds of some certain special creatures, nevertheless, yet in this work it profits little or nothing. And footnote here that I'm going to come back to this afternoon. Throughout this whole text, the author, the Cloud author, is consistently referring to contemplation as a work, which may leave some of you scratching your head because you're used to post-John of the Cross thinking of contemplation as a grace, right? But he is clearly thinking about it in this text and totally consistently as a work, something we do, something we are embarking on. And his instructions are given specifically throughout this text to somebody who wants to take on full seriously the work of contemplation. Okay, so he's saying there in the first place that although it might be quite possible to think about certain conditions and deeds of certain special creatures, nevertheless, yet in this work, it profits little or nothing. Well, we know that so much of our kind of cataphatic meditation, so much of what's called making a meditation in our, in the preparatory prayer life, certainly in the Christian tradition, is about thinking about the qualities of things, right? Meditating on God's gracious gifts, His goodness, meditating on the cross, meditating on the sorrow of Mary. We're taught in cataphatic piety to meditate in exactly that way, thinking about the qualities of things and allowing the qualities of things to jumpstart our emotional responsivity to us. That's how it classically works in most of what we're familiar with in Christian devotion and theological prayer, but not in the work of contemplation. And throughout this whole book, he's going to make a sharp distinction between what goes on in what we would call cataphatic prayer and what is going on in this other, the work of meditation. So he says this is what follows, that thinking about the virtues of God, thinking gratefully about it, imagining God, conceiving of God, thanking of God, emotionally interacting is not useful in the work of contemplation. And he says, why? This is because caring or thinking of any creature that ever God made or of any of their deeds is a kind of spiritual light. Huh? Now watch what he does with it. For the eye of the soul is opened on it and even fixed thereupon, just as the eye of an archer is fixed upon the target he is shooting at. Isn't that an extraordinary image? So he says, this is because thinking or caring of any creature that ever God made or any of their other deeds is a kind of spiritual light. The eye of the soul opens on it and fixes upon it. So this thought, this quality, this virtue, this creature becomes a target in the same way that the eye of an archer fixes on a target he's shooting at. See the subject-object thing? That any time we put an object there, it becomes the object that the eye of the soul fastens on and fixates on. This is so profoundly talking about attention in the subject-object configuration that, is shocking. And it's so shocking that William Johnson just completely changed the whole thing so that it doesn't even make sense, because it can only be accessed from the point of view of phenomenology, from the point of view that he's talking about the patterns, the configurations, the shape of consciousness and conscious attention. So he goes on to say after that, and the one thing I will tell you, that all that you think about is above you for a time and between you and your God. In other words, whenever you put your attention in that way that it's got an object of your attention, that object of attention is above you in that it is completely occupying your attention. It draws it, boom, and between you and your God. Because when your attention is fixated in that way, you're no longer in that undifferentiated field of diffuse awareness. And remember, that's exactly what I was saying before the break, when I had that experience myself where I had that great mother lode of an insight. Oh, I wanted it. Well, that was sort of the light, the target that the light of my soul was fixated on. And for the moment, I wanted only that. And then I realized that if I grabbed it, I would be thrown out of this other kind of awareness, this kind of cloud, this diffuse participational awareness in which divine awareness and my own are kind of intermingled, and that can only exist so long as you're not letting your attention be drawn out to objects. Okay? So that's what he's talking about. He says that all you think about is above you for a time. Them's fighting words. Think about that. Everything, it's above you because it completely consumes your attention. You disappear. And between you and your God, because he's saying very strongly in this work that if there's any access to participative, felt sense union with God, it exists when your being, when your consciousness is in this state of diffuse awareness, which he will call, or which he will identify with contemplation. Other than that, we're taking snapshots of our pictures of God and thinking about that. So he goes on to say, and to just such a degree, you are farther from God if you are concerned about anything else but God. And once you read that, you can begin to decode that language. He's not saying if you're concerned about changing your child's diapers or if you're he's saying that if you've placed your mind in this subject-object configuration so that you're thinking about something else, you're not thinking about God. And if you're thinking about God in that subject-object configuration, you're still not thinking about God. You get it? Because what we're talking about is a different quality of attention. Does that make sense at all? Does that begin to show you that as soon as you begin to see that the cloud works on this mainspring, that he's really, really concerned, he intuits that when we put our consciousness, when we put our attention in subject-object configuration, it interposes a barrier that draws us into a different operating system, if you want to call it that way, which is sort of below the threshold of where you really want to live if what you want to live with is this felt sense vibrational union with divine, if you want to enter the present relational field of divine being. Okay, so he's saying, let's get rid of these tendencies to put our mind in that subject-object configuration. And he's going to work that throughout the entire book, to the point where he's going to say over and over again that the practices that got you this far in your spiritual journey, the ones that you learn to do, the saying prayers, the thinking about the glories of Christ, even, God forbid, in this institution where I stand, the spiritual exercises until they go to a really deep level and fall through the subject-object barrier, belong to a level which is below the threshold of where he's setting the bar for contemplation. And if you want to do the work of entering this contemplation, and we're going to look after lunch at what he means by that, you have to cease and desist from those practices, at least for the time that you're doing the work of contemplation. And this will be a pervasive theme. What's there in chapter 7, and I didn't run it off, but I do have it in my book, and I take it apart for you blow by blow because it's hilarious. We all know that chapter 7 is the chapter in the cloud that the author, got, that William Menninger went to get his method of centering prayer in a nutshell. But that's only one paragraph in a fairly long chapter. And what leads up to it is one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen. I'm living for a centering prayer skit one day, which reenacts it, because it's a dialogue between this poor petitioner sitting there on their meditation cushion trying to do contemplation, the work of contemplation, and this pesky thought who sort of sidles in and gives this poor person some beautiful things to think about, In other words, is dangling the bait of insights and illuminations before the person. And you start to take it first thinking, oh, he's giving me such wonderful things. Now he brings my mind to the wonders and gods of God's mercies. Now he lets me see his glorious deeds and beneficences. Now he makes me feel the wondrous sorrow. And on he goes and says, and by and large, if you let him keep up with it, he will finally bring you down all the way to the passion. And at this point you go, oh, down to the passion? Isn't the passion the most powerful thing that Christians could possibly be meditating? But what he does, and he's exactly right, because he says there, as soon as you get doing the passion, Mel Gibson walk in the door. All of a sudden, it's drama, it's shame, it's guilt, it's you're completely out of the contemplative bulwark and back into the pathos of the emotions. And then he says, once you've bit the bullet there, then you'll start going from that right into looking at your own shameful and sinful life and all the things you have screwed up about. And then he says, and by the way, and after the while, then he will let you see some of the places that you lived in the past. And, so what you see is your attention is getting more and more scrambled. And finally, he says, and finally you find yourself in bits and pieces and you know not how. And he finally says, and the reason you got there is because you took his bait and did not put him down under the cloud of forgetting. So in other words, and you all know this for centering prayer, if when something twigs you and says, oh, thinking, if Yeah, well, let's just think it a little. It's kind of, juicy. And, that your attention gets more and more scrambled. It gets into emotional reactivity, and then after that, it just puffs and dissipates. It is an extraordinary portrait of how attention can scramble and dissipate once you take the hook of reconfiguring it in that subject-object thing. It's just brilliant and merciless and hilarious. And therefore do not take him, but say, get thee down, get thou down, under the cloud of forgetting. It's total Middle English. So I think one of the ways that the cloud helps centering prayer is it gives us a very, very strong backup that what Thomas Keating is doing when he's insisting on this teaching, that no thought is worth thinking. That's actually a Mary Morzowski quote, is he has absolutely strong resonance in the Cloud of Unknowing. That's exactly what this is saying. No thought is worth thinking if you are aspiring to this work of contemplation. Now, I think that the way that centering prayer can help the Cloud of Unknowing is that it takes this whole practice and brackets it a bit so that he's not saying all of a sudden 24/7 you can't think anymore. You got to wander around bumping into telephone poles while you keep trying to keep your attention. What centering prayer really gives us is 20 minutes twice a day to begin seriously to do this practice of withdrawing attention from thoughts and allowing it in those times, in those nanoseconds between the gaps, to take the configuration that it wants, to give us a foretaste that we aren't even consciously aware of. We're emotively aware of it, but not consciously, a foretaste of that undivided perceptual unity, which is contemplation. So it gives us that foretaste. It begins to lay down both attitudinally and neurologically the capacities to perceive, to actually run that program, if you want to call it that. And it does it for 20 minutes twice a day or however long you meditate. And the rest of the time, it's business as usual. Go on out in the world and think. Of course you got to use your mind to figure out how to get from here back to the subway station, or to figure out what you're doing for dinner or pay your income taxes or set up a retreat or whatever you're doing. Don't try and wander around like a idiot, well, here I am, God, here I am, Don't drive yourself nuts. Just do the practice in the 20-minute, twice-a-day bracketed time and know that you're setting something profound in motion. And over the period of a long time consistently working with this, you're going to find that there are some changes in your being. Some of them have to do with a loosening of the grip on your identity with your small self. Whether false self or what you think is true self, I don't care. You just don't go there. Your attitude towards life becomes more spacious, more unboundaried, more present. You're able more and more quickly to bring yourself into mindfulness in the moment. All these things will happen naturally, just out of the 20 minutes twice a day. And little by little, I would maintain that if you let that happen, and you're not constantly bringing your attentions and your preoccupations back to how well am I doing? What is the story of my life? Am I, if you're not going that way into the narrative so much, little by little, you're going to find that there's longer and longer stretches of time where that non-dual diffuse awareness is actually kicking in your life as the method by which you're tracking reality. In other words, what I'm going to call this afternoon, the gradual imprinting of the ascent to contemplative awareness, which is what we've been talking about all along. So I think centering prayer gives us a really, really wonderful way to practice this wonderfully challenging wager that the cloud of unknowing throws in our face, and to allow it to begin to transform our consciousness without driving us nuts. And I think that makes sense. Remember that if our understanding of this cloud is where it came from is correct, we're probably talking about Carthusian monastery. We're talking about an exchange between a master and a student who already would be spending much of his time in contemplative stillness, in withdraw of the attention from sensory objects, so that contemplation can become much more of a lifestyle for this person and this monk. As we take this out into the world, particularly helped by present-day maps of the levels of consciousness, I think we can find a way to work with this profoundly valid teaching in a bracketed way that still, if we're faithful with it, is going to work together with our other practices to transform and revalue how we see the world as contemplative Christians. So this afternoon, what I'm going to do is, after we open up, we'll talk about what is contemplation anyway. What is the contemplative lifestyle? What is the contemplative dimension of living? And I'm going to suggest to you that the way the Cloud of Unknowing author looks at it, it is a pretty good parallel for what we would nowadays call stabilized non-dual perception. So that will be the last bit of the training, and we're going to look at that by way of the extraordinary ladder of the levels of consciousness that you find embedded in Cloud Chapter.